There are places in this world that act as sponges. They absorb the grief, the agony, and the terrifying finality of death until the very drywall and timber becomes saturated with a sorrow so profound it mutates into something predatory. We like to believe that when we buy a home, we are purchasing safety, a sanctuary where we can lock the doors against the chaos of the outside world. But what happens when the chaos is already inside, waiting in the dark, embedded in the foundation itself? What happens when the history of a house isn't just a list of previous owners, but a catalog of corpses? Welcome to Nocturnal Ledger. Tonight, we open a case file that has terrified paranormal investigators, skeptics, and demonologists for decades. We are not discussing a screenplay, though Hollywood eventually tried to sanitize this horror for the masses. We are discussing the documented, sworn testimonies regarding the events at 208 Meriden Avenue in Southington, Connecticut. This is the true story of the Snedeker family and the funeral home they unknowingly made their bed in. To understand the horror of 1986, we must first understand the desperation that led the Snedeker family to Southington. This was not a move born of ambition or a desire for a scenic change. It was a move born of survival. Alan and Carmen Snedeker were a family in crisis. Their eldest son, Philip, was fighting a brutal battle against Hodgkin's lymphoma. The cancer was aggressive, and the treatment required daily trips to the University of Connecticut Health Center. The family was living in upstate New York at the time, and the commute was destroying them. The long hours on the road were agonizing for a sick child whose immune system was decimated by cobalt treatments. And the financial strain on the parents was becoming unbearable. They needed a miracle. They needed a home close to the hospital that they could actually afford. When they found the white, duplex-style rental on Meriden Avenue, it seemed like the answer to their prayers. It was spacious, historic, and shockingly cheap. The rent was low enough to make anyone suspicious. But desperation has a way of blinding us to red flags. Carmen Snedeker toured the house and felt a strange heaviness, a stagnation in the air that opening the windows couldn't clear, but she pushed it aside. She had to. Her son's life depended on being close to his doctors. It was only after they had signed the papers and begun moving their boxes in that the true nature of the property revealed itself. While exploring the basement, looking for space to store the overflow of a large family, they stumbled upon equipment that had no place in a residential home. Tucked away in the shadows of the low-ceilinged cellar were distinct industrial mechanisms. There was a hoist, heavy chains, and a strange system of rollers designed to move heavy objects with ease. But it wasn't just machinery. They found drawers containing calming chemicals, tools for reconstruction, and frighteningly specific medical supplies. The realization hit Carmen with the force of a physical blow. The strange layout of the downstairs, the wide doors, the oddly positioned ramp at the back entrance. This wasn't just an old house. For decades, this building had served as the Hallahan funeral home. The basement wasn't a storage area. It was the preparation room. The rollers were for coffins. The hoist was for lifting dead weight. And the room that Alan and Carmen designated as the bedroom for their two sons, Philip and his younger brother Bradley, was the very room where bodies were drained of their blood and pumped full of formaldehyde. Most people would have fled. Most people would have broken the lease that very hour. But the Snedekers were trapped by their circumstances. They had no money to move again, and Philip's treatment could not wait. They convinced themselves that the dead could not hurt them. They told themselves that a building is just wood and stone. They were wrong. The haunting did not begin with screaming apparitions or flying furniture. Like all true predators, the entity in the Snedeker house began by testing the waters, stalking its prey, and breaking down their psychological defenses. It started with the atmosphere. The house was perpetually cold. Not the chill of a drafty window, but a deep, bone-gnawing cold that radiated from the center of the rooms. The heating system would roar to life. The thermostat set to 80 degrees. Yet the family could see their breath in the living room. Then came the sounds. At night, when the heavy silence of the suburb settled over Southington, the house would wake up. Carmen reported the distinct sound of the chain hoist in the basement moving, the metallic clanking of chains, The groan of the rollers, the phantom sounds of a business that had closed years ago. It sounded as if the morticians were still down there, working the night shift, preparing the midnight arrivals for their viewing. The first victim of the house's direct influence was Philip. Because of his cancer treatments, his immune system was weak, but the doctors also warned that the medication could cause mood swings or hallucinations. The entity used this diagnosis as a shield. It hid behind the boy's illness. Philip began to change. The sweet, struggling teenager became withdrawn, hostile, and obsessed with the basement. Despite the terrifying history of the room, he preferred to be down there in the dark. He began writing in a journal. But the entries were not the thoughts of a teenage boy. They were dark, violent screeds about death, necrophilia, and hatred. He started drawing pictures that disturbed his parents' images of dismembered bodies and dark figures standing over him while he slept. When he tried to tell his parents that the house was speaking to him, that a man in a pinstripe suit was visiting him and telling him to do terrible things, they attributed it to the cobalt treatments. They thought he was suffering from schizophrenia induced by the stress and drugs. This is the tragedy of the Snedeker case. The medical reality of the cancer masked the supernatural reality of the infestation. The entity knew that no one would believe the boy. It isolated him. The activity escalated from psychological manipulation to physical manifestation. The water in the house began to behave in impossible ways. Carmen would mop the kitchen floor, and the water in the bucket would turn a deep, viscous red. It smelled of copper and rot. When she poured it out and refilled it, the water would turn red again instantly. It wasn't rust. It was the color and consistency of blood. The smell of the funeral home returned. The scent of decaying flowers, that cloying, sweet stench of lilies used to mask the odor of death, would suddenly fill a room, choking the occupants. This would be followed by the sharp, chemical burn of embalming fluid. These olfactory hallucinations were experienced by multiple family members simultaneously, ruling out individual delusion. Then, the physical attacks began. The entity seemed to feed on fear and sexual energy. The Snedeker's niece, who was living with them to help care for the children, became a primary target. One night, while lying in bed, she felt a hand move up her leg. Thinking it was one of the children seeking comfort, she reached down, only to feel a cold, hairless hand that dissolved into nothingness. On another occasion, she was in the shower when the shower curtain, a heavy plastic sheet, seemed to come alive. It wrapped around her face, tightening like a constrictor snake, cutting off her air. She clawed at it, gasping, fighting for her life against an inanimate object that was being manipulated by a force she couldn't see. Carmen Snedeker herself faced the most harrowing assault. She reported that while cleaning the house, she was suddenly pinned to the ground by an invisible weight. The pressure was immense, crushing the air from her lungs. She described the sensation of being sexually assaulted by something that wasn't there, a classic, terrifying example of an incubus attack. This wasn't just a ghost rattling chains. This was a demonic intelligence, seeking to degrade and violate the living. The breaking point for the family's denial came when Philip's behavior turned homicidal. The entity had worn him down, whispering in the darkness of the embalming room, until Philip finally snapped. He attacked his cousin, attempting to strangle her. He was physically restrained and taken to the hospital. The doctors were baffled. His cancer was one thing, but this psychosis was completely out of character. Philip, in moments of lucidity, screamed that he wasn't doing it. He screamed that the man in the suit was making him do it. With Philip removed from the house and placed in care, the family hoped the activity would stop. They thought perhaps Philip was the poltergeist agent, that his stress was manifesting the phenomena. But they were wrong. The activity got worse. Without Philip to torment, the entity turned its full attention to the rest of the family. Doors would slam with enough force to shake the foundation. Dishes would fly off the shelves and shatter against the opposite wall. The temperature in the house plummeted. It was then that Carmen Snedeker finally reached out for help. She didn't call a priest initially. She called the most famous paranormal investigators in the world, who happened to live in Connecticut, Ed and Lorraine Warren. When the Warrens arrived at 208 Meriden Avenue, the atmosphere changed from one of confusion to one of spiritual warfare. Lorraine Warren, a trance medium, was immediately overwhelmed by the psychic imprint of the house. She refused to even enter the basement initially, stating that the presence was too strong. She described seeing not just spirits, but demons. The investigation by the Warrens, along with other researchers, uncovered a disturbing theory about the history of the funeral home. While the Hallahan Funeral Home was a legitimate business, rumors began to surface, later amplified by the Warrens' findings, that the morticians who worked there were not merely preparing bodies. The allegations were horrific. It was suggested that the undertakers practiced necromancy, the act of communicating with the dead for knowledge or power. Even more disturbing were the claims of necrophilia, that the dead were violated on the very tables where Philip slept. According to demonology, acts of necromancy and the desecration of corpses are open invitations. They are rituals that tear the veil between the worlds. The Warrens believed that the morticians had created a doorway, a portal in the basement, and that something non-human had come through. The spirits of the dead were not the problem. They were merely trapped there. The problem was the inhuman spirit, the demonic entity that was feeding on the souls of the trapped dead, and now, the suffering of the Snedeker family. The investigation brought in researchers who spent weeks in the house. They documented sudden temperature drops of over 20 degrees in seconds. They recorded strange, guttural voices on tape recorders. One researcher, who was a hardened skeptic, reported looking up the staircase and seeing two demons dancing in the living room. The Warrens declared the house to be infested by demons. They brought in a Catholic priest to perform an exorcism. This was not a simple blessing. This was a battle. The priest reported being physically slapped by invisible hands. The family gathered together as the prayers were read, and the house reacted violently. The walls groaned, and the smell of brimstone and rotting flesh became unbearable. What makes the Snedeker haunting so unique and so terrifying is the sheer volume of witnesses. This was a family of 6, plus cousins, plus researchers, plus clergy. However, true to the nature of such high-profile cases, the skepticism that followed was just as aggressive as the haunting. We must address the counter-narrative to understand the full picture. The author, Ray Garton, who was hired to write the book In a Dark Place about the haunting, later came out and claimed that the family's stories were inconsistent. He alleged that he was told to make things up to fill the pages, and that the family was suffering from drug addiction and mental health issues rather than demonic oppression. Neighbors reported that they never saw anything unusual from the outside. But this skepticism fails to explain the collective trauma. If it was all a fabrication, why did the family endure it for so long? Why did the niece, who had no stake in the family finances, corroborate the stories of sexual assault by invisible forces? Why did the researchers record physical anomalies in the house? The psychological impact on the Snedekers was permanent. Even after the exorcism, which quieted the house enough for them to eventually move out, the scars remained. Philip eventually passed away, not from the demon, but from his cancer. Though his mother always believed the stress of the haunting accelerated his decline. The cancer, which had gone into remission for a short time after they left the house, returned with a vengeance. To this day, 208 Meriden Avenue stands. It has been renovated. The funeral home basement is now just a basement again. New families have lived there. Some report nothing. Others report a feeling of being watched, a shadow in the corner of their eye, or a sudden chill on the stairs. The Snedeker house haunting forces us to confront a terrifying possibility that the past is never truly gone. It suggests that human suffering, especially the kind found in a place of death like a mortuary, leaves a residue, a stain. And if the conditions are right, if a family full of fear and sickness moves in, that stain can become active. Was it the medication? Was it mass hysteria? Or did the Snedekers accidentally walk into a feeding ground for something ancient? The evidence, the police reports of disturbances, and the testimonies of the Warrens suggests that for a few years in the 1980s, hell established a zip code in Southington, Connecticut. As you lay in bed tonight, listening to the settling of your own home, ask yourself, do you know the history of the ground you sleep on? Do you know what stood there before the foundation was poured? Because the Snedekers didn't. And by the time they found out, the ledger had already been opened. This has been a case file from the Nocturnal Ledger. The darkness is always recording. Sleep well, if you can.